Hello there, I'm Pete, the Canadian Villa fan, normally waxing poetic on all things Aston Villa, as I will be this weekend when they visit Chelsea. However, I thought I'd broaden the scope of my horizons and delve into a special expose I'm calling Against the Law. Because I am against a law, specifically Law 12, fouls and misconducts, pertaining to the horrendously inconsistent handball legislation. I'm going to show you why we've completely lost the plot on these particular decisions, and I will provide a solution that I think is both evolutionary, objective, and will actually benefit all the stakeholders all at once. I find it peculiar how IFAB, the International Football Association Board, the entity responsible for law revisions and amendments, could in 3 short months completely rewrite the laws surrounding goalkeeper behavior during shootouts, i.e. the Emi Martinez housery laws, eliminating all of his dark arts in a matter of 3 short months. Yet after 2 decades, we still don't know what a handball is from week to week. We, the fans, should have a seat at that table, quite frankly, because we own the game. We are the largest stakeholder in football. We need to have a voice because FIFA doesn't own it, IFAB doesn't own it, UEFA doesn't own it, and no single club owner owns football. We do. And I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but people around the world are really starting to let their voices be heard over a number of issues. We need the same thing in football. We need our voices heard, and we need to make sure they are continuously heard. Now, I imagine the spirit of the law as it was originally written, and we have to always understand, if we're talking about evolving laws, what the spirit behind them was. And initially, I'm sure, it was to make sure that only goalkeepers within their area could handle the ball and prevent the ball from going in the goal. And I'm sure they also didn't want players blocking the ball from reaching their opponents. I also would imagine that that time with rugby and football sort of delineating and evolving on their own, that they wanted to distinguish the two very clearly. What I'm sure they didn't imagine was how nuanced and complicated, like offside, the handball law would become. And one of the big problems right now, because of the ambiguity, is it means VAR is meddling in so many of these decisions. Here is a beautiful example of many. As a Canadian, this moment was embedded in me because it gave Canada its first chance to score a goal in World Cup history. Sadly, we squandered it. However, Yannick Carrasco from Belgium apparently handled the ball, got a little tiny touch of it. The ball deviated. VAR told the referee to do a review, which he did on field, after which a penalty was awarded. This was the biggest sporting event in the world, the World Cup 2022 in Qatar. 3 months later, Aston Villa is hosting Bournemouth. Late in the first half, this happens. Jack Stevens gets a hand on the ball. It deflects the ball over the crossbar. There was no suggested review from VAR. There was a check and no penalty given, which perplexed everybody, including the pundits, the fans, several players. So my question to you is, what's the difference between those two? And which of those two decisions was wrong? We must objectify this law, because subjective and gray area benefits nobody. Then we have Luca Dean at Crystal Palace earlier this year, who jumped to get into an aerial duel. The ball brushes so gently off his fingers. Yes, it did deviate the course of the ball. And after a VAR check, a penalty was awarded, and that penalty ended up being a goal, which turned out to be the game-winning goal. Even Dermot Gallagher, the former referee turned referee apologist in the media, said this was a harsh decision and probably the wrong one. Luca Dean knew absolutely nothing about this ball hitting his hand. You cannot contest an aerial duel. In fact, you cannot leap without using your arms. It is physically impossible. And herein lies the frustrating inconsistency, ambiguity, and contrarian nature of this law, and why it drives fans and players nuts. Not to mention, we should be doing everything we can for referees to make decisions easier in real time and keep VAR out of the equation. Now, the Luca Dean example is a beautiful case study in a bigger overarching theme that we have to consider when we talk about revising laws. And that is, does the punishment fit the crime? Because according to the laws, the way they're written now, by jumping up and using your arms to get leverage and then having the ball suddenly just deflect off your fingertips and go wide is punished in the exact same way as this. And I'm sorry, but the punishment for those kinds of handball have never fit the crime. And none of the examples I've shown you so far are intentional. I'll give you a couple of other words, better words. They are involuntary and they are incidental, but they are not intentional. And that's an important distinction. The laws were convoluted further when, for some reason, it was changed that if it hit your thigh and then hit your arm, well, that's not a handball now because it hit another part of your body before it hit your hand. How is that objectifying the law? It's not. If the ball hits your hand or your arm, it should be a handball. Let's start there. Objective. Black and white. Now, my solution may be considered radical by some, including the good folks at IFAB, because they are loath to tamper with history. And that's what we're talking about here, history. And nobody likes a major departure from the past. However, football has shown us that there have been many evolutions to laws. The best one I could think of is the old pass back to the goalkeeper who was able to pick it up, then bounce it, then roll it a few yards before picking it up again and bouncing it and then clearing it. That was a positive change for football. And this solution, in my opinion, is simple and logical. And it starts with the critically important distinction of intentional versus involuntary or incidental, because those are huge distinctions here. And the solution involves another in word. Involuntary and incidental is punished with an indirect free kick anywhere on the field, including the penalty area. I've had this discussion numerous times with certified and decorated referees because I've been banging on about this for such a long time. And they say, well, there's still gray area and subjectivity in the distinction between intentional and not intentional. I'm not having it. We know what an intentional handball looks like. Well, it looks like 2010 World Cup Uruguay versus Ghana when Luis Suarez demonstrated his superb goalkeeping technique because he absolutely had to keep Uruguay in the World Cup. The punishment was correct, a penalty and an ejection. And as it turned out, Uruguay did stay in the World Cup and advanced from this round. But that's what intentional looks like. You cannot tell me that a ball that brushes up against an arm or a hand that's incidental, especially at the outer fringes of the penalty area, not in goal-scoring dangerous areas, being given penalties from 12 yards away does not befit the crime. Here's a great example of does the punishment fit the crime? I was calling this game. Throw-in comes in, skips up off the turf, and hits Kendall Waston's arm. Did he mean to? Of course not. But it definitely hit his arm. The ball deviates because it skips off his arm. Indisputable. But is this worth a penalty that would ultimately decide a playoff game in the late stages? Did FC Dallas deserve this through hard work? Was this an attacking player weaving his way into the box before a defender makes a mistimed slide tackle, wiping him out and drawing a penalty? And that is the distinction that we have to consider before we can even get into the minutiae and the fine details of interpretation. Here's another recent and perfect example of the unpredictable and conflicting nature of the interpretation of this law and why it needs revision so badly. Thomas Souček for West Ham against Chelsea. And the pundits afterwards were hilarious because depending on which side they were on, they make these funny excuses like, well, he was falling and in his natural falling motion, he would have braced himself with his arm. We add these addendums, by the way, to make the laws more confusing, natural, unnatural, all that kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter is, Thomas Souček's hand potentially prevents the ball from going in the Chelsea goal. Do I think he did that intentionally? Absolutely not. He was falling. That's where his hand went. But if we want this to be an objective law, black and white, hits your hand. Sorry, Thomas, but that's an indirect free kick from that spot in the penalty area. Is that as automatic as a penalty? No. Tight angle and location to hit a free kick. But it'll be fun to watch, and I think the punishment does suit the crime here. You objectify the law, you call all handballs 100% of the time. It's black and white now, and then you make the distinction. But I believe intentional handballs are so rare, they might not even make up 1% of the total amount of handballs. Nobody wants to get sent off or give away a penalty, I believe, unless you're Luis Suarez in the 2010 World Cup. So black and white. The outcomes are very positive. There are 3 that I could think of. You are no longer deciding a World Cup semifinal in the VAR booth on some kind of chintzy handball decision at the top corner of the box nowhere near the goal. Secondly, and by default, you are lessening the impact of VAR because a referee now sees it's a handball, the ball deviated. If there's an advantage to be played, play the advantage, just like any other infringement. But it's easier for the referee in real time because a handball is a handball. But the third benefit to this change is now all of a sudden we will start to see some exciting indirect free kicks in dangerous areas within the penalty box that will require innovation both from the attacking sense and the defensive side. We have seen some fantastic set-piece routines over the course of history. We just don't see them very often. These are rare, and frankly, I don't mind seeing them more often. This one from Leon Bailey with Leverkusen a while ago was absolute carnage. You can't tell me that this is somehow less dramatic than a penalty. No, it's the opposite. And so you're going to see managers and players innovate, both on the attack side and the defensive side. There will be decisions to be made between goalkeepers and where they position themselves and defenders, especially when the wall is backed right up onto the goal line, and good players have the opportunity of excelling from these positions. I think indirect free kicks like these will be an asset to the game, not a liability. To summarize, would this law revision maintain the integrity and the spirit of the law in which it was originally written? I think it does, because you're still not allowed to block a goalward-bound ball with your hand from going in the goal. That's still a direct free kick penalty and an ejection for the denial of an obvious goal-scoring opportunity. Are we objectifying the law for match officials and making it easier for them to call it in real time? I think we are. It's a handball, black or white. The next question, incidental involuntary or intentional? Are we reducing the amount of VAR intrusion into these kinds of decisions? I believe there would be fewer. I don't mind if VAR looks to see if a ball hit a hand on the way to goal in a crowd of players, or whether there's ambiguity between incidental and intentional, but I think that would happen less often. And would we be creating some really exciting moments in the form of indirect free kicks from all around, maybe even the 6-yard area, leading to innovation and cool set-piece routines? Why, of course we would. I know some will say, well, clever players are just going to try to flick the ball up off a defender's arm in the box to win an indirect free kick. Defenders are already doing their jobs with their arms behind their back, and they have done for a long time. And yeah, you can get into minutia like, well, if your arms are at your side, how can you deviate the course of the ball? It's when your arms are out that the problems start. Do you agree with this proposal? Because if you do, I'd love for you to share it with somebody you know and love in football, and tag IFAB and FIFA while you're at it. If you don't agree, leave a comment in the section below, and propose a better way of dealing with a law that has flummoxed the game for so long and, quite frankly, ruined a lot of games far too often. And it seems like it's just getting worse. Remember, we as supporters are the biggest stakeholders of the sport. Without us, there is no sport. There's no money. There's nothing. We have a voice. We need to be at the table. Let's use our voices. And thanks for watching.